I died. Not in the way the doctors meant and not in the way you'd see in a movie. No dramatic beeping, no blinding light, no whispered goodbyes. I died in the quietest way imaginable. I died the moment my mother looked the doctor in the eye and said, "She's not our real daughter. We owe her nothing." And then they left. I was still breathing. Machines kept me alive. But something deeper, something fragile and essential fractured inside me. Not my ribs, not my spine, not my bruised brain, but something people call spirit. The part of you that says I matter. That part shattered. I had no way of responding. My body wouldn't move, my mouth was slack. My eyelids were sealed shut as if stitched from the inside. But I heard everything. "We'll need authorization for surgery," the doctor had said. "There's intracranial pressure. She's stable for now, but the next 24 hours are critical." Silence. Then my mother's voice, calm and cool as an air-conditioned boardroom. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Joanna isn't biologically ours." The air changed. "She listed you both as emergency contacts," the doctor said, tone shifting, gentle but firm. "We were her guardians years ago," my father added. "It was never formal. We're not legally responsible. They had once fed me, tucked me in, called me their daughter. But now, standing before the doctors meant to save my life, they rewrote history like it was just a typo to be corrected. Without consent, we may need to proceed under emergency statute," the doctor said after a beat. "I'm sorry," my mother said. "But we can't help you. We're not her family." And that was that. The door opened. Then closed. I couldn't see them walk away, but I felt the absence like a vacuum, like something was unhooked inside me. And that's when I died. Not biologically, not officially. But something in me collapsed quietly, completely. And yet, someone stayed. "I'm just adjusting your IV. Sweetheart," came a different voice closer to my ear. Female. Younger. Warmer. "You're doing amazing. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere." I would come to know her as Emily Davis. Nurse. 29, loves red licorice and sad country songs. And at that moment, the only human being in the world who saw me as someone worth saving. I don't remember her face then, I couldn't open my eyes, but I remember the sound of her voice like a lullaby I never had. "They just left," she whispered once. "They said you weren't theirs. I've never seen anything like it. But you're not alone, okay? You're not invisible to everyone." She held my hand. I couldn't hold back, but I felt the pressure. I remember willing my fingers to squeeze back to say, "I hear you. Thank you." It would be days before I could move. Weeks before I could speak. Months before I would be strong enough to sit upright on my own. But something began that day, not just survival but a choice. They had walked out, but I hadn't left myself. Not yet. It's strange what you hear when you're trapped in your own body. You hear prayers whispered over you by strangers. You hear hospital staff arguing about coffee orders. You hear music in the hallway, Vivaldi, then Taylor Swift. You hear the quiet moments that no one knows you're awake for. But the thing I heard most clearly was my own story unfolding. You see, that night wasn't an isolated betrayal. It was the final act in a play that had been running for 28 years. I just hadn't known I was the understudy in my own life. I didn't understand yet what they'd told the hospital. That the adoption was never formal. That I wasn't really their child. But deep down, some piece of me always sensed I was. Borrowed. Loved conditionally. Tolerated. Useful until inconvenient. That's what trauma does, it sharpens your intuition while dulling your voice. I had learned early on to be quiet, to be excellent, to earn space. But lying there still and unseen, something in me finally shouted from the inside. No more. They thought I wouldn't survive. They thought they could walk away and that would be the end of me. But what they didn't realize is this. Sometimes being abandoned is the beginning. Sometimes being discarded is how you learn to claim yourself. Sometimes survival isn't just a heartbeat, it's a declaration. I would survive. And when I did, I would tell my story. Not to shame them. Not even to seek revenge. But because truth, when told, becomes freedom. For me. For others. So this is my truth. I died the night my parents refused to save me. But I also came back to life. And that life, that second chance, it would belong to me. There's a photo on the bookshelf in my grandmother's old house, now mine. It shows the four of us, my father in a crisp polo, my mother in pearls, me in a pink dress with neatly combed hair, and Claire, my younger sister, grinning with 2 front teeth missing. It looks perfect. That's the thing about photos. They don't capture what happens between the frames. They don't show the quiet neglect, the invisible line that divides one child from the other. They don't record the words never said or the affection unevenly poured. From the outside, we were the quintessential American family: white colonial house with blue shutters, a manicured lawn, 2 daughters, a golden retriever named Scout. Birthday parties with matching plates and balloons. Family vacations to Cape Cod and Disney World. Our fridge always had magnet poems and Claire's crayon drawings. My straighter report cards tucked into a drawer. Growing up in that house was like playing a role in a play I hadn't auditioned for. I was the responsible one, the quiet achiever, the girl who did what was expected without causing waves. Claire, on the other hand, was spirited. That was the word my parents used with pride when she threw tantrums in grocery stores, when she refused to eat her dinner, when she talked back to teachers. She's just full of life, my mother would say with a fond smile. Once Claire knocked over a glass vase in the living room while we were running through the house. I was 5. When Mom came in and asked what happened, I said I did it. It wasn't a lie, not exactly. I had been closest to it. Later that night, I heard my mom on the phone. Joanna's always so eager to please. Not like Claire. Claire's got spirit. That word again. Spirit. It wasn't long before I realized spirit meant deserving of attention and obedience meant easy to ignore. Claire got the bigger bedroom with the bay window and the built-in bookshelves. I got the room at the back, smaller, no sunlight afternoon. When I asked why, my mother said, "You're more practical, sweetheart. You don't need all that space." On family nights, Claire got to choose the restaurant. We always ended up at the place with the plastic play area and bland chicken nuggets. Once I suggested sushi. My father laughed. "That's too grown up for Claire. Let your sister have her fun." And I did. Again and again, I let her have her fun. My drawings, careful renderings of trees and horses and buildings, were slipped into folders, praised quietly but never displayed. Claire's stick figures with big heads and lopsided dogs covered the refrigerator. "She needs encouragement," my dad explained once when I asked. "You're already good at things. She's still catching up." I didn't argue. I swallowed it like I swallowed so much else. But the questions started forming. Not loud. Not accusatory. Just whispers at first. Why does she get celebrated for things I do without praise? Why does being good come with silence and being loud come with love? What did I do wrong? By the time I was 8, the pattern was clear. Claire messed up, she was forgiven. I achieved something I was expected to keep achieving. No party, no big deal. It became a quiet game I played with myself. How invisible can I be before they notice I'm missing? Once I stayed up all night finishing a diorama for school, complete with moving parts and painted backdrops. I got a perfect grade. My parents barely blinked. The same week, Claire won 2nd place in a spelling bee. We went out for ice cream. When I asked why, my mother said, "She tried so hard." So did I. At 12, I was the top of my class. But even then, my accomplishments were met with a kind of pleasant indifference. My father once told me, "You're just naturally gifted. Claire needs more support. Try to be understanding." Understanding. I tried. I really did. I loved Claire. I still do. But love doesn't erase the ache of being overlooked. The truth finally cracked open late one night. I had gone downstairs for a glass of water. It was past midnight. The lights were off, but I could hear my parents in the kitchen. Their voices were hushed but sharp, like they had argued this same argument 1,000 times. "You always favor Claire," my mother snapped. "That's not fair," my father replied. "We agreed from the beginning we'd treat them the same." "She's not even yours," my mother hissed. "She's not yours either." "Margaret," my father shot back. "We said we'd raise her like our own." I dropped the glass. It shattered, the sound slicing through the dark like a scream. Their voices stopped. Footsteps came toward me. I sprinted back upstairs, heart pounding, body shaking. I climbed into bed and pulled the covers over my head just in time to hear my mother open the door. "You okay, honey?" she asked. I pretended to be asleep. Pretended I hadn't heard the truth. That I wasn't theirs. Not really. That night, 1,000 childhood moments rearranged themselves in my memory. The missed birthdays. The quiet corrections. The constant comparisons. Suddenly it all made sense. I was the child they chose but never truly claimed. And from that moment on, a question began to live inside me. If love isn't given freely, is it love at all? If my childhood home was a stage polished, scripted, and full of silences, then my grandmother's house was a sanctuary. Grandma Evelyn lived in a sprawling Victorian in Cambridge, painted a soft blue with cream trim, the porch wrapped around like an embrace. The windows wore lace like old ladies at church, and the whole place smelled like cinnamon even in July. I don't know if it came from her baking or just the wooden floorboards soaked in decades of kindness, but the scent felt like safety. I started spending summers there when I was 13. It was framed as a convenience, easier for everyone, my mother said. But it felt like something else. A rescue. With Grandma Evelyn, I wasn't the quiet one or the background character. I wasn't compared or corrected. I was just Joanna. And that was enough. She made me pancakes with chocolate chips even when I said I didn't need breakfast. She let me pick the music in the kitchen and sang along off-key and joyfully. She asked questions and actually listened to the answers. Her backyard was wild with hydrangeas and hummingbirds, and we'd spend hours under the maple tree reading old books or just talking. She had a crooked pinky finger from falling off a swing as a child, and I used to hold her hand and trace it absent-mindedly while she told me stories, not fairy tales but real ones. About her years as a nurse. About my mom when she was a child. About the war. About regret. "I wasn't always kind to your mother," she told me once. "I was too busy trying to make her perfect." I didn't say anything, but I understood. My mother had passed that same burden down to me like a dress that never quite fit. One afternoon when I was 15, we were sitting on the porch shelling peas, and she looked at me and said, "You have your mother's eyes." I paused. "You mean Mom's?" "No," she said softly. "Your real mother." I froze, a pea slipping from my hand and bouncing off the bowl. She didn't say anything else for a while. Just kept shelling the peas, hitting the metal with quiet plinks. I wanted to ask 100 questions. Who was she? What happened? Why don't I know her? But something about Grandma's face told me not now. Not yet. Later that evening, I tried again. Who was she? My birth mother. Grandma Evelyn smiled gently, patting my hand. "Someone who loved you very much but couldn't keep you. When you're older, I'll tell you everything." That became the refrain. After high school. When you've settled into college. After graduation, once your career's on track. Later, after I started my company, when the time is right. I never pushed too hard. Because even though the mystery tugged at me, I didn't want to risk losing the only person who made me feel whole. She was the only one who remembered my birthday without needing a reminder. Who mailed me cards with quotes from Maya Angelou or Emily Dickinson. Who called just because she had a funny story or wanted to know how my meetings went. She was the only person who never made me feel like I had to earn my place. Sometimes when things got bad at home, I'd close my eyes and imagine myself in her kitchen, the old radio playing jazz, the wind through the open window, cinnamon lingering in the air like a secret. She used to say, "The world will try to tell you who you are. But you already know. You just have to keep listening." At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. But I held on to the words like a charm in my pocket. Each summer with her was like pressing pause on a life that never quite fit. I got to breathe. I got to become. I got to feel seen. And isn't that what every child needs? Not perfection. Not praise. Just one person who sees you, really sees you, and says, "You're enough." For me, that was Grandma Evelyn. When I was 23, I took a detour during a business trip and spent a weekend with her. She had aged, her hair fully white now, her steps slower, but her spirit was the same. We baked apple crisp and stayed up late talking. That night, sitting in her cozy living room, surrounded by books and the familiar scent of cinnamon and old wood, I tried again. Grandma. Who was she? My birth mom. She looked at me with eyes full of so many things: grief, memory. Something else I couldn't name. I want to tell you, she said. And I will. Soon, but that soon never came. Because 6 months later she was gone. In her sleep, peaceful, alone. My parents didn't call me. I found out through a lawyer's letter, cold and personal, informing me that Grandma Evelyn had left me her house and most of her estate. She was gone. And she took the truth with her. Or so I thought. I would come to learn that she hadn't left me with nothing. She had left me with everything. Not just a house, but proof. Answers. And something more valuable than all of it, the seed she'd planted in me every summer with her, this belief that I was worth seeing. Worth loving. Worth the truth. The last Thanksgiving I ever spent with my family began like any other. A table set with too much silverware. A turkey that was more for tradition than taste. Polite conversation wrapped in thin layers of tension like cellophane stretched tight over something spoiled. I wore a navy blue dress and a smile that had become muscle memory. Claire sat beside me laughing at something Dad said about hospital politics. My mother floated between the kitchen and the table like a restless ghost, checking the cranberry sauce, adjusting place cards no one read. It had been a good year for me. My company had just closed Series B funding for our AI diagnostic platform. We were on track for national implementation, maybe even international. Forbes had called me one of tech's rising stars under 30. I didn't bring any of that up, but someone else did. So Joanna, my father said, dabbing the corner of his mouth with a cloth napkin. Tell us about this medical software thing of yours. It's going well, I said carefully. We've just signed a contract with a major hospital network. It could really change the way early diagnostics are done. She's being modest. Grandma Evelyn added, her voice still strong despite her frame seeming more fragile this year. She's doing something extraordinary. Yes, well, my mother chimed in, already reaching for the wine bottle. She always was determined to prove herself. The words landed in my chest like a rock dropped in water, small, heavy, and spreading outward. Prove myself, I echoed, trying to keep my tone neutral. Is that what you think I've been doing? My father gave a dry chuckle, sipping his Pinot Noir. Isn't it most adopted children go through that phase? Overachievement. It's quite common, actually. The room shifted. Air changed. Claire's fork paused midair. Evelyn's smile vanished. And me, I froze. What did you say? I asked, my voice suddenly unfamiliar to my own ears. My mother waved her hand like she was brushing away a fly. Oh, Joanna, you've known since you were 12. Don't be dramatic. My heart pounded. No, I said, staring at them. You denied it. Every time I asked, every time I begged for the truth, you said I was dreaming. You told me I was imagining things. Well, my father said, still so composed, we thought it was better that way. Children need stability. Certainty. We didn't want to confuse you. You gaslit me, I whispered. You made me feel crazy for seeing what was right in front of me. My mother placed her glass down too firmly. We gave you everything, Joanna. A roof. The best schools. Do you know how many adopted children would kill for the life we gave you? I looked at Claire then. She was staring at her plate, lips pressed together. I turned to Evelyn, hoping for something rescue maybe. But she looked tired, sorrowful, her hands resting gently in her lap. I tried so hard to be good, I said. To earn it. The place at the table. The praise. The love. I thought maybe if I was perfect enough you'd forget I wasn't yours. You are ours, my grandmother said softly. But the silence from my parents spoke louder. You never wanted me, I continued, voice cracking. You wanted a trophy. A daughter you could show off to your friends and take credit for, but not one you had to feel. My mother's jaw tightened. This isn't the time, Joanna. It's exactly the time, I said. I'm tired of pretending I belong in a family that sees me as a burden or a branding opportunity. Joanna, my father said, his tone sharp now, that's enough. No, I stood up, napkin falling to the floor like a flag of surrender. What's enough is me trying to chase after scraps of affection from people who never really wanted me here to begin with. I looked at Claire. Her eyes met mine, wide, wet, uncertain. Claire, I said, did you know? She shook her head slowly. No. I mean, I always wondered why it felt different. But I didn't know. Not like this. I'm sorry, I whispered, meaning it. Not just for the night. For the years I'd swallowed my resentment. For the ways I had pulled away from her even when she didn't deserve it. Joanna, Evelyn said gently. Sit down, darling, eat something. But I couldn't. I turned and walked out of the room. Out of the house. Out of that life. No one followed me. I changed my number the next morning. Signed a lease for a new apartment within a week. Evelyn was the only one who still had my address. We started meeting for brunch every Sunday away from the shadows of that house. They do love you, she told me once over cinnamon tea and blueberry pancakes. Love isn't supposed to be this hard, I said. She didn't argue. She just reached across the table and squeezed my hand. It was the last Thanksgiving we ever had together. And somehow, I knew it would be. It was raining that night, the kind of cold, stubborn New England drizzle that made everything shimmer and blur. I should have called a car. Samantha even told me to. Joanna, go home. The update can wait until morning, she said as she gathered her things from the office couch. But I wasn't ready. There was always one more thing to check. One more bug to fix. One more task to keep me from sitting alone in my apartment with the weight of everything I never said at that Thanksgiving dinner. So I stayed. And when I finally left, it was past 10. The streets were slick. My wipers fought to keep up with the rain. I remember humming to a playlist I didn't even register, my hands tight on the wheel. Just 15 minutes to get home. What could happen? At the intersection of Maple and 3rd, the world stopped. Headlights. Bright and sudden, blinding. Metal against metal. The sound of glass shattering and something deep inside me tearing. Spinning. I remember spinning. The weightlessness of it. Then the silence. And darkness. The next memory is not mine. It belongs to Emily. Nurse Emily Davis. I wouldn't really meet her until much later. But she was there first. She saw me when I couldn't see anything at all. You're doing great, Joanna, she whispered, adjusting the IV line. We're taking care of you. You just keep holding on, okay? She read the chart. Noted the swelling. Whispered things I couldn't answer but still needed to hear. There's music outside. They're playing Adele in the hallway, she said once. I'll cue up some Taylor Swift for you next shift, I promise. She was just a voice. A rhythm. A kindness in a sea of pain. My body was broken, 3 ribs, a fractured collarbone, a traumatic brain injury. I was placed in a medically induced coma to control the swelling in my brain. I couldn't open my eyes, couldn't move. But I heard them. The doctors. The machines. And eventually, my parents. I'm Dr. Chin, managing your daughter's case, a calm voice said. What happened? My father asked. Dr. Chin explained the collision. The coma. The swelling. The need for surgery. And what exactly are you doing for her now? My mother asked, her tone clipped like this was a billing inquiry. We're monitoring intracranial pressure and keeping her sedated to prevent further damage. She'll need surgery to repair the orbital fracture as soon as she stabilizes. And what does that cost? My father asked. There was a pause. The doctor, I imagine, gave them that look, the one medical professionals reserve for those too cold to be real. We'll need insurance information and authorization for surgery, she said. Then came my mother's voice, too calm. There's been a misunderstanding, she said. Joanna, she isn't actually our daughter. I wanted to scream. Wanted to rip out the cords and shout that I was right there, but I couldn't move. She has you listed as her emergency contact, Dr. Chin said, confused. We adopted her. Informally. The paperwork was never finalized, my father said smoothly. She's not our legal responsibility, my mother added. We owe her nothing. I screamed inside. The machine beside me beeped louder as if it understood the betrayal better than they ever did. I'm sorry, Dr. Chin said firmly. But she's your emergency contact. And she's critically injured. Find someone else, my father said. "We're leaving." And just like that, they walked away. Emily stayed. She cried quietly after they left. "I've never seen anything like it," she said to someone. She could die, and they just left. She was the one who called Samantha. "She's your business partner, right? You're listed on her medical directive," Emily explained on the phone. "They refused to authorize care. But if you can get here." Samantha arrived an hour later, drenched in rain and fury. "She's like family," she told the hospital staff. "Do whatever she needs. I'll sign." She sat beside me every day, fielded calls, sent updates to the team. She fought. And because of that, because of her, I lived. The surgery was performed on day 5. The swelling reduced. Slowly, consciousness returned. I remember the light first. Then pain. Then Emily's voice. "You did it, Joanna. You made it." But part of me hadn't. Because something else had died in that trauma room. The last remnants of the belief that love, no matter how flawed, might still show up for me when it mattered. They didn't call. Not when I was 5 and lied to protect Claire. Not when I was 12 and begged for the truth. Not on Thanksgiving, when they admitted the lie. And not now, when my life hung by threads. They didn't show up. But Samantha did. And Emily. And later, a lawyer holding a letter from a dead grandmother with more honesty than either of my parents ever managed while alive. I wasn't just fighting death in that hospital room. I was fighting the narrative that I wasn't worthy of being saved. But I was, and I would write a new story. One where I survived. And where the people who mattered were the ones who stayed. The envelope was heavier than it should have been. Samantha handed it to me carefully, like it might break. Her expression was cautious, the way you look at someone who's just survived hell and might not be ready for the next storm. "It came from your grandmother's attorney," she said gently. "He's been trying to reach you. There's a lot in there." I waited until the hospital had quieted. Until Emily had finished her rounds and the pain meds dulled the ache behind my ribs. Then, with shaking hands, I opened it. Inside was a letter in my grandmother's handwriting, elegant looping cursive, and several official-looking documents. Legal forms. Certificates. A will. My heart pounded as I unfolded the first page. "My dearest Joanna, if you're reading this, I've failed to keep my promise to tell you everything in person. Forgive an old woman's cowardice. Some truths are harder to speak aloud than others. You've wondered about your birth parents. You deserve to know. Your mother was my niece Caroline. She was only 18 when she found out she was pregnant. Bright, impulsive, full of hope and fear. The father was her high school boyfriend. He left for college and didn't look back. Caroline wanted to keep you. She truly did. But she was so young and her family had already placed so much shame on her shoulders. I suggested adoption within the family. My son Richard and his wife Margaret had struggled to conceive. They were aching for a child. It felt like a perfect answer. What I didn't foresee was that Margaret would become pregnant with Claire just weeks after taking you home. Suddenly they had 2 daughters, one planned, one not. And from that day on, I watched the difference in how they treated you. I confronted them many times. Richard always promised to do better. Margaret, I fear, never truly saw you as hers. But make no mistake, Joanna. You were legally adopted. I've enclosed the court documents and amended birth certificate. Whatever lies they've told, whatever doubts they've sown, know this: you are legally and irrevocably their daughter. More importantly, you are my family. You always were. Caroline never married. She passed away 5 years ago in a car accident. But before she died, she asked about you. She wanted to know if you were happy. I told her you were brilliant, that you were building something powerful, that you were loved. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I kept waiting for the right time. Perhaps deep down I feared you would look at me differently. But I see now truth delayed is still truth. The house, the estate, everything I leave behind is yours. Not just by blood, but by love. Because you are the kindest, strongest soul I know. And I am proud to call you mine. All my love always, Grandma Evelyn. Tears blurred the ink as I read it again. Caroline. A name I'd never spoken but somehow always felt hovering in my bones, and now she was gone. A mother I never knew. A girl not much older than I was when I first started to question who I really was. A ghost in the family tree buried beneath shame and secrecy. But she had loved me, and Evelyn had loved me. Maybe that was enough. I reached for the rest of the documents, shaky, clumsy fingers unfolding layers of truth. My original birth certificate. Caroline Mitchell listed as my mother. The adoption papers signed, stamped, complete. My amended birth certificate with Richard and Margaret Mitchell listed as my legal parents. Then the will. Evelyn had left the house, the estate, all assets in trust for me. The entire inheritance they were now circling like vultures trying to contest was legally mine. Not because of technicalities, but because of intent. Of love. When Samantha returned the next morning, I handed her the letter. She read it quietly beside my bed, her eyes misting as she reached the final paragraph. "She really loved you," she said, voice soft. "You know that, right? I do now. You also know your parents are going to lose their minds over this." I nodded. "Let them. They're still claiming the adoption was never finalized." I gestured to the documents. "Let's see them try now." Samantha smiled, a small, dangerous smile. "You're going to fight them, aren't you?" "Not for the house," I said. "Not even for the money." "Then for what?" "For me. For the girl they dismissed. For the silence they imposed. For every time I thought I had to earn love to deserve Heir. For Evelyn, who saw me. For Caroline, who couldn't keep me but never stopped wondering if I was okay." It's strange how one envelope can change everything. It didn't make the scars disappear. It didn't undo the betrayal, but it shifted something in me. A center of gravity. A kind of anchor. I wasn't an outsider. I wasn't a placeholder. I wasn't an accident. I was chosen. Maybe not by the people I thought, but by the people who mattered. The house was quiet, but not in the comforting way it used to be when Grandma Evelyn was alive. It was the kind of silence that pressed in on your ears, made your thoughts echo louder. I sat at her old dining room table, the one with scratches from decades of Sunday dinners and birthday candles. A stack of blank pages rested in front of me, and a pen lay beside them like a challenge. This was where I would write the letter. Not a letter to make amends, not a letter to seek closure. A letter that would finally free me from needing anything from them ever again. I stared at the page for a long time before writing the first words. "Dear Richard and Margaret, you'll find this letter waiting on the table of a house that no longer belongs to you. Perhaps you came expecting to collect keepsakes, or more likely to stake a claim. But the only thing here for you is truth. I write to you not as a daughter, but as a survivor of your silence, your coldness, and finally your abandonment. I write not because I need a response, but because I no longer want to carry your absence like a wound. When the doctors asked for consent to save my life, you told them I wasn't your child. You walked away without signing the papers. You walked away without a single word. That moment, more than the crash, nearly killed me." I paused. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had never been said. The first draft I wrote a week ago was nothing but rage. Line after line of bitterness. I had typed so hard the keyboard keys stuck. But when I read it back, it didn't feel right. It wasn't me, it was the scared girl still begging to be noticed. And I wasn't that girl anymore. The second draft was cleaner, colder, clinical. Like a lawsuit. But even that gave them too much power. Now I wasn't writing to punish them. I was writing to release myself. You didn't just fail to show up in that hospital room. You failed to show up for decades before it. Every time you celebrated Claire and quietly overlooked me. Every time I asked a question and was met with "don't be dramatic." Every time I made the honor roll and was told, "Well, of course you did." You never saw me. You only saw the performance. And when the performance no longer benefited you, you exited the theater. I thought of all the ways I had tried to earn their love: perfect grades, a scholarship to MIT, building a company before I turned 25. Each achievement felt like another brick in the wall I thought would protect me from the truth. But walls don't keep out rejection, they just muffle the sound. I sipped cold tea and continued writing. I used to think forgiveness was something I owed you. Now I understand it's a gift I give myself. So I forgive you. Not because you asked for it, not because you're sorry, but because I refuse to carry the shame that was never mine to begin with. I forgive you so I can move forward, so I can love freely, so I can build a life that doesn't begin and end at your doorstep. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. I will always remember the truth, but I will no longer be defined by it. You do not get to tell my story. I do. I printed the letter, folded it carefully, and slid it into an envelope. On the front, I wrote my name in the cursive Grandma Evelyn had taught me when I was 10. I could still hear her voice in my ear. Always end your letters with love, even if the person doesn't deserve it. It's a gift you give yourself. But I didn't sign it with love, I signed it with my full name. Joanna Evelyn Mitchell. The Evelyn meant everything now. I stood in the quiet of that old house and placed the envelope in the center of the table. I adjusted the vase beside it, empty now, but once filled with cinnamon-scented flowers Evelyn had grown in her back garden. And then I whispered, not to them but to myself. This is where it ends. Not the pain, but the hold. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying leaves in little swirls across the porch. I sat on the swing Evelyn and I had spent so many summers on. My body still ached in places from the accident, little reminders of how close I came to never writing any of this. But as I rocked gently in the dusk, I didn't feel broken anymore, I felt lighter. It wasn't revenge that gave me that feeling. It was letting go. Letting go of who I thought I had to be loved. Letting go of the version of myself built to survive them. And embracing the woman I'd become in spite of it all. It was a Saturday afternoon painted in stillness. Not the peaceful kind, but the anticipatory kind, like the hush before a verdict. I sat in Samantha's living room, a laptop open on the coffee table between us. The security feed from Grandma Evelyn's house was up, 4 camera angles arranged neatly on screen. The envelope was right where I left it, centered on the dining room table, the air in that room thick with something unspoken. At 2:03 p.m., a black Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Showtime. Camera 1 just picked up movement at the front porch, Samantha said, voice low and steady. I leaned forward as the image sharpened. There they were. Richard and Margaret Mitchell. My parents, biologically not, but legally, unfortunately, still on paper. Behind them, a few paces slower, was Claire. Her coat was too thin for the cold, her posture said hesitation. Her eyes darted toward the stained glass of the front door, as if some part of her remembered summers spent there with Evelyn and another part of her already knew she wouldn't be welcome anymore. Richard jiggled the front doorknob, frowning. The key isn't working, he muttered. Try the back, Margaret said with her usual irritation. We shouldn't have to, this is our family's property. No, Claire said so softly we barely caught it over the mic feed. It was Evelyn's. A locksmith arrived 15 minutes later, called by Richard, signed for by Richard, and paid for, presumably, by the estate he was trying to steal. And then they were inside. I watched them move through the foyer like vultures circling a carcass. Margaret ran a hand over the hall table. She always did have good taste, she said, eyeing a crystal vase. We're here for memories. Claire reminded her not to redecorate your foyer. Margaret waved a hand. Don't be naive, Joanna's not going to recover fully. The judge will award us guardianship. It's just a matter of time. Claire stopped. She's in physical therapy. I've read the reports. She's doing better. Richard appeared from upstairs. The silver is all there, he announced. No one's touched a thing. That was when they entered the dining room and saw the letter. What's this? Richard asked, reaching for it. It's addressed to Joanna, Claire pointed out. Well, she's not here, is she? Margaret said, snatching the envelope from his hands. My breath caught. She opened it. Her eyes scanned the first page. Then the second. Her face drained of color like ink bleeding off paper. She didn't speak, she just passed it to Richard. His expression changed from smug to stone. His jaw clenched. This is outrageous, he finally said, voice rising. Lies. Manipulations. Claire held out a hand. Let me see it. No, Richard snapped. Family business. I am family. Claire replied and took the letter from him. She began reading silently, lips parting slightly as the truth filled the space around her. Margaret sank into a chair, theatrically distressed. This is taken out of context. We were in shock. It says you told the hospital she wasn't your daughter. Claire interrupted. That you owed her nothing. Margaret hesitated. That's not how it happened. There's a video, Claire said, holding up her phone. She included the link. Let's watch. We watched her watch it, and we saw her break. The camera caught every word. My father's voice calm and clear, she's not our daughter. My mother's cold response, we owe her nothing. Claire closed her eyes, then opened them again, something new rising behind her pupils. You left her, she whispered. You walked away. She's not our, Margaret began, then stopped. As if saying it again would make it less damning. Not your daughter, Claire said, voice trembling but resolute. You raised her for 28 years. You called yourself her parents. She was a child who loved you, and you left her to die. She's not really, Richard started. Not really what Claire demanded. Not really yours, because legally she is. And morally she shook her head. You abandoned your own child. Don't act surprised that she's finally telling the world. I watched from the screen as Margaret stood up too quickly and tried to reclaim authority with that condescending tone she'd perfected. She's clearly been poisoned against us. That Samantha girl, no, Claire cut in. Don't deflect. Don't blame other people. Don't rewrite the story. She knows about the conservatorship, Richard said suddenly. She knows we're trying to protect the estate. Claire laughed, a short, bitter sound. This isn't about protection, it never was. It's about control. We gave her everything. Margaret shouted, eyes wide. A beautiful home. The best education. She should be grateful. Claire shook her head slowly. You gave her everything but love. The room fell silent. Even through the screen, I felt it. She turned to leave, hands trembling, letter still clutched in her coat pocket. I need time, Claire said at the doorway, voice softer now, but edged in finality. And not to protect you, but to protect myself. Claire, please, Margaret reached for her. Claire pulled back. Don't, she said. You've taken enough from both of us. And then she was gone. They stayed in the house for another 20 minutes, rifling through drawers, muttering about legal strategy, whispering names of attorneys and family friends they might bribe or guilt. But they never mentioned me again. They were too busy trying to clean up the mess they made. They still didn't understand the truth. That I didn't need them anymore. And neither did Claire. The message came late at night. I had just turned off the lamp and was settling into the quiet hum of the old house. My phone buzzed against the nightstand. Claire, do you still call me your sister? I stared at it for a long time. My thumb hovered over the screen. Yes, no, I don't know. Instead, I typed Cambridge Street Cafe. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. I didn't sleep much. There were too many echoes in my chest of birthday candles we once blew out together, of whispered secrets under shared blankets of years that should have made us close, but somehow made us strangers instead. The next morning I arrived 5 minutes early. The cafe hadn't changed. Same brick walls, same dusty light bulbs strung overhead like they were trying to be romantic but only managed tired. The same corner booth where Evelyn and I had once spent a rainy afternoon sipping hot chocolate. Claire was already there. 2 coffees sat on the table. She looked up as I approached, her eyes scanning the fading scar on my cheek, the cane I still used on rough days. She stood awkwardly, caught between reaching out and holding herself back. We nodded. No hugs. Not yet. Black one, sugar, she said, nudging a cup toward me. You remember, I said, surprised. She gave a small shrug. I remember a lot more than you think. We sat in silence for a moment. She picked at the edge of her napkin. I traced the rim of my cup. I didn't know, Claire said quietly. About the hospital. About what they did. I swear, Joanna, I didn't know. I believe you, I said. And I did. Because as much as our childhood had been unequal, Claire had never been cruel. Oblivious. Yes. Sheltered. Beneficiary of favoritism. But not a villain. I watched the video 4 times, she said, voice cracking. I kept thinking, they must have been confused. Scared. In shock. But they were calm. Cold, like they'd rehearsed it. They didn't flinch, I whispered. She shook her head. They didn't even ask if you were in pain. I looked away. Claire leaned in slightly. The letter. You wrote them. Was it true? Every word. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. Scrolled to the file. Want to read it for yourself, I offered. She hesitated, then nodded. I handed it to her. As she read, her shoulders slowly folded inward. Her face tightened. A few tears slipped down unchecked. When she finished, she handed it back, wiping her cheek. That's the most honest thing I've ever read, she said. And the saddest. I said nothing, because it was both. She cleared her throat. I used to think they were hard on you because you were older. Because you were the smart one. I thought maybe they expected more. They expected nothing, I corrected gently. They just didn't care. Claire winced. I should have noticed. I should have said something sooner. I let her sit in that discomfort. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, at least not out loud. She was just trying to be here. To show up. To listen. You were a kid too, I said eventually. A kid who was loved without conditions. That's not your fault. She looked up at me, eyes red-rimmed. Is it too late? For us, I mean? I stared into my coffee. There was a part of me that wanted to say yes. That wanted to protect the fragile healing I'd earned by keeping everyone out. But then I remembered Evelyn's porch. The swing creaking in the wind. The sound of her voice, always gentle, always patient. One person who sees you, she once said. Sometimes that's all it takes. Claire had never truly seen me. But she was trying now, and maybe that counted for something. I can't pretend the past didn't happen, I said softly. I can't flip a switch and forget everything. But her breath caught. We can try, I finished. Little steps. If that's what you want. Her relief was immediate. Like a balloon quietly deflating, tension leaving her shoulders. Little steps, she repeated. I can do that. We sat for a while longer talking about safer things, her hospital residency, a patient who brought cookies to every appointment, a doctor she couldn't stand. I told her about Samantha, about the software we were building, about Emily quitting the hospital to join a private care team. She laughed at something I said. I couldn't even remember what. But the sound made something shift inside me. Familiar, soft, like an old melody I thought I'd forgotten. We walked out together. At the door, she hesitated again. Joanna, she said. If I had known back then, I stopped her. You didn't. Then I smiled just a little. But you do now. Claire moved in on a rainy Tuesday. She arrived with just 3 suitcases, a plant that had seen better days, and a hesitant smile that said, I don't know if I belong here, but I want to try. I had the East Wing prepared. It wasn't fancy, just clean sheets, fresh towels, and a window that looked out over Grandma Evelyn's old herb garden. She used to say the rosemary kept away bad dreams. I hoped that was still true. Are you sure about this? Claire asked, standing in the hallway clutching her suitcase like it was a life vest. I am if you are, I said. And I meant it. There were rules, of course. Not spoken aloud, but understood in the gentle silences we allowed each other. We each had our own routines. Mornings were private, shared meals were optional. Boundaries weren't just respected, they were cherished. But slowly, tentatively, life started to grow in the quiet. Claire brought home takeout on the nights I worked late. I helped her review for her board exams, quizzing her on neuroanatomy over bowls of cereal. She started watering the garden in the evenings, humming old tunes under her breath. I caught her once whispering something to the rosemary. Just telling them to be kind, she said sheepishly. They listen better than people, I replied. We laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Samantha came over every Saturday with groceries and gossip. Emily visited on Sundays, usually with cookies and the soft kind of concern that doesn't pry. James Wright, Grandma's lawyer, joined us occasionally for brunch. He brought wine and stories and a calm presence that reminded me of Evelyn in the best way. And somehow, without planning it, those Sunday meals became a tradition. Not every week. Not perfectly arranged. But enough to matter. The dining room, once the stage for so many silences, began to fill with life. One afternoon, I looked around the table, Claire passing mashed potatoes to Emily, Samantha arguing playfully with James about the best 80s pop song, the fire crackling behind us. And I realized this was family. Not because we shared blood, but because they stayed. Because they showed up when I was at my weakest and didn't look away. Claire caught my eye across the table. She smiled. Not the nervous seeking approval kind, the kind that says I see you. And maybe finally I know you see me too. Later that evening, after the dishes were done and the laughter had faded into the warmth of memory, Claire and I sat on the front porch. It had rained again, the kind of soft drizzle New England does so well, and the smell of wet leaves hung in the air. "Do you remember the last Thanksgiving at Mom and Dad's?" Claire asked. I nodded. "Like a scar remembers the blade." She winced. She paused. "I wish I had spoken up sooner. I wish they had loved louder," I replied. We sat in silence for a while. Fireflies blinked in the distance. Somewhere a dog barked once and was quiet. "You know," Claire said slowly, "growing up, I always thought family meant people you were stuck with, like it was just preassigned. And now," she looked over at me, "now I think it's the people who stay when you fall apart. The ones who choose you even after seeing the worst." I smiled. Evelyn would have liked that definition. She would have liked these Sunday dinners too. She would have insisted on real tablecloths and fresh herbs in every dish. Claire laughed. And complained that we don't make enough cinnamon tea. We looked out at the garden where the rosemary was thriving. I thought of the home we were slowly building. Not just the wood and windows, but the trust, the rituals, the shared silences that didn't need to be filled. It wasn't the family I had been born into, but it was the one I'd chosen. And somehow that made it even more sacred. Bridgemine started with a scribble on a napkin. One chilly afternoon, I was sitting at the window seat in the living room, the winter light casting long shadows across the floor. My laptop was open, but I wasn't typing. I was thinking. Remembering. The sound of my own breath under an oxygen mask. The muffled voices. The way the world blurred but never quite went away. I could hear everything I whispered once to Emily. I just couldn't move. Couldn't respond. She nodded. "That's common. But hard to prove. Families give up. Doctors assume. And patients disappear," I said. That silence, mine and so many others, haunted me. So I decided to build a bridge. A real one. Not of wood or steel, but of neural patterns, machine learning, and hope. BridgeMind was born. A software that uses brain activity, eye movement, and micro-responses to detect consciousness in patients who appear non-responsive. It started with a prototype we called Echo. Then came calibration phases, test cases, ethics boards, hospital partnerships. Emily joined as our clinical advisor. Claire, with her background in neurology, offered insights only someone who had lived inside an ICU could provide. And me, I gave it my memory. My silence. My truth. We worked out of the converted library in Evelyn's house. Whiteboards covered the walls. Coffee cups multiplied like rabbits. Every week brought breakthroughs and breakdowns. Some nights I fell asleep at my desk. Other nights I woke from nightmares and wrote code until sunrise. But slowly, piece by piece, the bridge was built. BridgeMind went into beta trials 9 months after we started. We had our first success at St. Joseph's Memorial in Vermont, a teenage boy who had been unresponsive for 3 weeks after a ski accident. The EEG patterns were erratic. The doctors had started discussing long-term care options. We installed our software. 48 hours later, we had proof of consistent awareness. The boy's mother wept when she saw the blinking code he used to say, "I'm here." I cried with her. Because I remembered how it felt to scream silently in a room full of people who wouldn't listen. That spring, I was invited to speak at a neuroscience conference in Seattle. I stood on stage, still leaning slightly on my cane, a reminder of the journey my bones had taken, and looked out at a crowd of professionals, skeptics, researchers. "I spent 12 days in a medically induced coma," I said into the microphone. But I was awake. I heard my parents say they didn't want to authorize my care. I was conscious, just trapped. The room was still. BridgeMind was born from that moment. From that silence. From the question, what if we could speak without speech? What if no one had to be invisible again? There were tears in the front row. Claire stood backstage, arms crossed, proud in her quiet way. Emily beamed from the wings, mouthing, "You did it." Afterward, a man approached me. His daughter had been in a coma for 5 months. "They tell me to let her go," he whispered. But I swear she blinked when I played her favorite song. "We can help," I said. And we did. Bridge mine spread. Hospitals signed on. Families reached out. Foundations offered grants. The software changed. Grew smarter. Kinder. And so did I. At night, when the house grew still, I sometimes sat in Grandma Evelyn's old armchair, hands curled around a mug of cinnamon tea. I'd look at the porch where she once sat with me and imagine her voice. "You turned it into something beautiful, darling," she'd say. "You gave your pain a purpose." One evening, Claire joined me. "I read about Bridge Mind in a journal," she said, sitting beside me. "They called it revolutionary." I smiled. "It's a start." She nudged my knee with hers. "You changed lives, Joe." I met her eyes. "So did you." "You stayed." She nodded. In that moment, I didn't see the little girl who got the bigger bedroom or the teenager who didn't speak up. I saw my sister, the one who brought me soup when I had migraines, who did the dishes without asking, who learned how to listen. We'd built a family around shared dinners and software bugs and Sunday brunches that never started on time. Around truth. Around choice. And now we were helping others be seen, heard, felt. I once believed the most powerful thing I could do was survive. But now I knew, the real power was helping others survive too. The summer night was warm, the kind that settles over your skin like a soft shawl. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and went silent. Fireflies blinked in the backyard like shy stars, winking in and out of the tall grass. Claire stepped onto the porch, 2 mugs in her hands. Cinnamon tea. Grandma's old recipe. Without a word, she handed one to me and sat beside me on the swing. We rocked in a quiet rhythm, the old chains creaking just slightly. The wood beneath us was cool and worn smooth by memory. "This was her spot," Claire said softly. I nodded. She always said the porch knew more secrets than the attic. We both smiled, sipping slowly. The tea was strong, almost too strong, but perfect in its own way. After a long silence, Claire asked, "Do you ever think about it? What would happen if they called? If they apologized?" For real, I didn't answer right away. The breeze rustled the rosemary in the garden. The same one she watered now. The same one I once whispered my rage into. Finally, I said I used to imagine it all the time. What I'd say. How I'd make them hear me. But now I looked over at her, and in the low porch light I saw myself reflected in her eyes, not the wounded version of me, not the girl who begged to be chosen, but the woman who had survived. "I don't need them to apologize anymore," I said. Really, really. Because I've learned to love the part of me they couldn't." Claire exhaled like she'd been holding that breath for a long time. "I'm not there yet," she admitted. "You don't have to be," I said. "That's the thing about healing, it's not a race, it's a rhythm." The fireflies continued their silent dance. Across the porch, the lantern Grandma Evelyn had hung years ago still swayed gently. Claire leaned her head against my shoulder. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch. "You know," she whispered, "when we were kids, I thought you were the strong one." I laughed softly. "That's funny. I always thought it was you." "Maybe," she said, "we were both wrong. Or maybe we were both right." A car passed in the distance. Its headlights briefly illuminated the garden, then faded. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" Claire asked. "They'll rewrite the story in their heads," I said. "They already have. But understanding, that would require admitting who they were." She was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. "For not seeing it. For not standing up sooner." I placed my hand over hers. "I'm just glad you're here now," and I meant it. Because sometimes family doesn't show up when they're supposed to. But when they finally do and stay, you make room. Later that night, I found a photo of Grandma Evelyn in her reading chair. I placed it on the fireplace mantel next to a small sprig of dried cinnamon. "This is your house too," I said aloud, "and we're finally filling it with the kind of love you always wanted for us." In the hallway, Claire was humming again. In the kitchen, Emily's cookies sat cooling on the counter. Samantha had left her favorite scarf on the back of the chair again, like she always did when she planned to return. And in my chest, where pain used to hollow me out, there was something new growing. Not joy exactly. Not closure. But peace. The kind that comes not from forgetting what hurt you, but from knowing it no longer defines you. The kind that whispers you are not broken. You are reshaped. That night, before heading to bed, I recorded one last entry in the journal I had kept since the accident. If you've ever been the one left behind. I wrote, if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who were supposed to love you, know this. You are not alone. And you are not unworthy. You have the right to create a family from the people who show up. From the ones who stay. From the ones who see you wholly and without condition. I paused. Then added, you can still belong. You can still begin again. As I closed the journal, I whispered the words aloud like a lullaby to the girl I used to be. Joanna. Seen. Loved. Enough.